Welcome in. Okay, so I'll start the lecture now. So thank everybody for coming along. This is the very first lecture in a set of short lectures that I'm giving every Wednesday at 1 o'clock New York time. I'll be giving a long set of lectures at the same time on a Thursday, and Tony is one of the people. If you Tony's in the red shirt there, or the red jumper, he's been one of the regulars for the long course. This is trying to pitch a course, shorter amounts, more digestible, and hopefully a larger audience. So let's see how we go. So I'll just go and share my screen. Hang on a second. And share this one.
So Steve, do we have access to the long course also then or not?
No, well, that's a $500 a year number.
Okay.
But you'll get what has happened is in the long courses, what I've done is refine the content over time. So this will probably be a better but shorter delivery than the long course. Just changing the layout of my window here. I've got two screens so I can see everybody in one screen and the presentation in the other. Well, let's just basically, I'm going to turn sideways to look at my own screen here. So pardon me, looking away from front on. So to introduce myself, you all know I was a professor of economics before I retired. Now I'm an honorary professor at UCL. Did my PhD, or graduated with my PhD back in 1998. Not all that long ago. It's been a very strange journey, 25 years. And I'm now a distinguished research fellow at the University College London, which is an honorary position. And I'm crowdfunded, as you probably also know, on Patreon and Substack. That's why I've been able to maintain my activity since I retired from being a paid academic. But the most important thing I want to cover is what I was and what I looked like 50 years ago. That's me. And that's at a student protest. I think it's actually 1975. The guy next to me was one of my successor in running the student rebellion against the teaching of economics there. But I established with a group of other young students when I was 18 years old. We began rebelling against what we're being taught in mainstream economics. So I knew there was something very wrong with the discipline way back then. And remarkably, we had the first ever student revolt against the teaching of mainstream economics in 1973 at Sydney University. We actually shut the department down. We had something like about I'd say 10% of the students were active in the student movement, and I mean really active, like leafleting and postering and things like that. It was a remarkable experience, and we held what we called a day of protest about the nature of the lectures. You can see how long ago. This is when you used to make posters. You had to cut silk screen printing, I think they called it, to make a poster. It was hand carved. So that's the protest back in 1973, July 25. So over 50 years ago. And since then, I didn't intend to do this, but it's what I've ended up doing. I've dedicated my life to trying to fix economics, and that's a large reason why I'm still doing the course, the activism I'm doing. Also, why I put these courses on. So I ended up explaining the many fallacies in mainstream economics through a book called Debunking Economics, and that there's a long gestation behind that, but finding how wrong the mainstream theory was and then having to laboriously go through the literature to find out where the flaws came from. I thought I've got to save other people that trouble. And I knew many activists were being snowed by economists saying, you can't do this because of X. And I say, like, X is garbage. Don't let them snow you. Okay. You've got a right to continue making the case you have for social welfare or whatever else. I've then realized that it's an inability to do modeling the right way, which is a major reason why economics is so badly handicapped today. So I developed a software package called Minsky. It's based on what's called system dynamics, and I'll take you through that during this course of lectures. I'm proud of the software package. The one thing it does that no other program does is enable you to model the monetary system. And of course, that's a major failing in how mainstream economists think. And I think it's a fun program to use. I know it's intimidating when people first use it. It's addictive once you start learning how to use it. And what I'm now working on is what I'm calling a new economics. That's my most recent book, published in 21, I think. And that is like a mini manifesto on how I want to approach economics. And I'm now writing an actually more extended and more technical version, which I'll hopefully publish towards the end of this year. But we should have realized something was badly wrong with economics back in the global financial crisis. because that was the biggest crisis since the Great Depression. And yet neoclassical economics not only did they not see it coming, they ended up recommending policies that made the recovery from the crisis slower than it needed to be, and it increased the inequality, which anybody here is likely suffering from. Very few would be likely to be benefiting from the level of inequality that's come our way. So we have to change it. It's absolutely fundamental, I think, to the survival of human civilization. And it may be too late, frankly, to be able to hang on to civilization. I want to hang on to as much as we can, and I want people to know why it failed if it does fail. And mainstream economics, in my opinion, is going to lead to the collapse of capitalism. It really is that bad. And when you look at the actual arguments in the mainstream, the best way to understand it is to call it Ptolemaic economics. It's an earth-centric, equilibrium-obsessed view of how the economy operates, which is as accurate a description of the economy as Ptolemy's model was of the universe. Now, at the same time, Ptolemy's model, with all the tweaks that were done over time, could fit the data really well. It could predict where Mars was going to be in 20 years' time. It could tell you when there was going to be an eclipse, et cetera, et cetera. And it was completely wrong about the structure of the universe. And the similar thing applies to neoclassical economics. They can fit it to past data, but it's completely wrong about the nature of the economy itself. So we need a whole new paradigm. It isn't just a case of better models. It's a whole new paradigm. And I've started developing it. And honestly, again, I'm 70 now. One of my best friends died today, a guy called Bob Ayres, who was a marvelous physicist who got involved in the energy approach to economics. Bob's died, and his approach to economics is still a minority approach. The same thing is likely to happen to me. So the only way to prevent that is to have a cohort of young people come along who are going to bring about a new economics. And that's what these lectures are about, and the Minsky software to enable young people in particular to build a new economics. And again, to show why we needed it, the most obvious example is the 2008 global financial crisis, because the mainstream thought those crises were impossible. And the level of arrogance and hubris that you saw coming forward at this time was, to me, just nauseating, but I had to live with it because they were the mainstream. So they actually predicted 2008 was going to be a great year for the economy. And they ended up giving policies that meant the actual crisis that occurred lasted longer. And they have not touched the actual cause of the crisis. So we're still, in a sense, in the aftermath of that crisis without escaping it. Too much private debt. So after the one reason I stuck my neck out and said there's going to be a crisis was that I knew if I didn't do that before the crisis occurred, then I wouldn't be listened to after. So I really pushed my personal profile in Australia because that's where I was living and based at the time. And then after that happened, Dirk Bessemer, who's now become a good friend, as you can imagine, a Dutch accounting and economic academic, put together a beautiful paper saying, we've been told nobody saw this coming, but I've identified a dozen people, at least a dozen, who did see the crisis coming. And the reason was they had to have a theory that made some sense as to why the crisis would occur. So when I realized the crisis was likely, it was actually in December of 2005. And I just knew with publication lags and journals, there was no point in trying to write journal papers about it. I had to go to the media and blogging. So I set up a blog at the time, and I was blogging incessantly and very, very vituperately against the mainstream. And my argument, what I put in a very simple form in one of the blog posts in May of 2007, is that you can't have normal continuing when there's an unsustainable trend of private debt in the data. And this has come because of the exponential growth in debt relative to GDP. At some point, that debt ratio has to stabilize, and it won't just simply stabilize, it'll go into reverse. And when that does, we'll have a recession. So that was May of 2007. And that's what happens. This is showing you the data, the American data. And the black line at the top line is private debt, obviously. The bottom line, the black line is the unemployment rate. The purple line is credit, which is the change in debt. And you can see they're virtually opposite to each other. Rising credit means falling unemployment and vice versa. That was the basis of my argument. Empirically, it was established by past events, but of course, the mainstream still dominates. So I predicted that turnaround would happen in the private debt ratio. I said that when it did, credit would go negative, which is what it did, and that would cause unemployment to explode, which is what happened. So I'm not saying I'm a god here, but I'm saying I've got a correct paradigm. And that's the big difference. The neoclassical living with a false paradigm. They could no more see this coming than Ptolemaic astronomers could see a comet arriving on a regular basis, because their paradigm doesn't allow for it. So that's the real problem there. That's a link to my software, by the way. I haven't actually given you a link yet to Ravel. I will, but we've got a couple of bugs that need to be sorted out first of all. So I'm going through a bit of a development process before we do that. So if you look at the mainstream again, not only do they have no idea a crisis is coming, they saw bright times ahead. Here's Bernanke in 2004 saying that at a conference called "What Have We Learned Since 1979?" 1979 being the beginning of the Volcker period of putting up interest rates and trying to drive inflation down. He said, well, we've seen a marked reduction in inflation and economic volatility, and this is called the Great Moderation. And we've got much less frequent recessions, much milder, volatility has declined, and there's a good argument that improved control of inflation, which of course is what mainstream economists are on about, has contributed in important measure to this welcome change to the economy. All they could see was good news. Now, Nobel, by the way, I put Nobel Prize in inverted commas whenever I talk about economics, because it's not a Nobel Prize. For those of you who don't know, its full name is the Swedish Central Bank Prize in Economic Science in honor of Alfred Nobel. They established it. They pay for it. The Nobel family has been trying to get rid of it for 50 years. But what it was used to was the central bank was conservative economists, and they were fighting an anti-neoliberal strand, a social democratic stand in Swedish politics. That's why it was established. So, but anyway, they give it to people like Robert Lucas, and he became, in 2003, he became president of the American Economic Association, and this is his valedictory speech, I think the Americans call it. He said, macro was born as a distinct field in the 1940s in response to the Great Depression. It was the body of knowledge that we hope would prevent the recurrence of that economic disaster. He says, my thesis in this lecture is that macroeconomics in this original sense has succeeded. Its central problem of depression prevention has been solved for all practical purposes for many decades. 4 years before the crisis began. In 2008, Cotis, who was then the chief economist for the OECD, wrote that the current economic situation, May of 2007, this is when I wrote my prediction of the crisis, he's predicting this is the best economic situation we've had in years. We have a rebalancing scenario, quite benign forecast, soft landing in the United States, buoyant activity in China, sustained growth, strong job creation, and falling unemployment. And 2 months after that was published, it was published in June as it happens, the crisis began. And the dated to, I've got the actual date there. I'll put the lecture up on the website once I've got given this the full lecture here, and you can go through and see the BNP's news press release explaining why they were shutting down redemptions from 3 of their funds. Now, what was happening is they were looking at these trends and they're extrapolating them forward. So the black line is the unemployment rate and the red line is the inflation rate. They're both heading down, and they basically thought this is going to continue forever. We're going to have very low unemployment, very low inflation, and aren't we great? And they had no idea that this was about to happen. Unemployment exploded to 10% of the population. In fact, if you used the same statistics they used back here, it would have been 14%. There have been revisions in how unemployment is defined that have reduced the recorded rate quite substantially. So it was, using historic measurements of unemployment, the worst crisis since the Great Depression. And we actually had deflation. For a short while, prices were falling by 2% per annum. Didn't last, and that's where some of their policies did work in that way. But even after it started, they didn't think it would be all that bad. So this is Dave Stockton, who was a bit of a comic, the chief economist for the Federal Reserve at the time. And he said at his, this is December 11, so we're 4 months into the crisis now. And he said, growth is going to pick up back towards potential in 2009, so a couple of years away. A very benign picture, that word benign again. If an economist says your situation is benign, see another doctor. So we're going to avoid recession, modest edging off of inflation. Now, the National Bureau of Economic Research does post-dating of when recessions occurred. So this was before they'd actually done their prediction, but they said the recession began in the month that Stockton was saying there wasn't going to be a recession. It shows how out of touch they are. Now, even a year later, and I find this quite remarkable, I did quite a bit of correspondence with Olivier Blanchard through direct messages on Twitter after the crisis began. He strikes me as a decent human being, which is unusual for a neoclassical economist. He most of them are very arrogant. It goes with the territory, but he's very deferential and nice to correspond with. So I quite liked him. And in August of 2008, I was actually at my computer when I saw an email from the National Bureau of Economic Research announcing his self-publication of this paper called The State of Macro. So it wasn't a case of publication delays. He posted this to the server in August of 2008, saying that this has been, all the fights over macroeconomics have been tough and painful and blah, blah, blah. The state of macro is good 1 year after the crisis began. Now, how blind do you have to be? Okay? It's like the Earth's just been hit by a meteor and you're saying the state of the atmosphere is good. And I said it is actually a non-peer-reviewed site. So if you check out the working paper link there, you'll see these are not peer-reviewed. So there's absolutely no delay to excuse him saying a year after the crisis began that macroeconomic theory was in good shape. Now, what then happened after that as well? They didn't expect a crisis. They weren't prepared in any sense at all. And what they did was they turned to their textbooks. And poor old Obama, I feel in some ways sorry for him because he's a lawyer and a political scientist. And he suddenly found himself having to manage an economic crisis. And he swallowed the advice he was given by the mainstream. And they told him that if you want to boost the economy, give banks excess reserves because they'll lend out every dollar they get. Will co-create 8 or 10. There'll be a lending boost. Private debt was not a problem. Again, this ignorance about the role of private debt. So that's the money multiplier model. And he literally said that, and you'll find that in the New York Times, that particular article. And then again, they themselves explaining their ideas. This is Bernanke saying large increases of bank reserves, a quantitative easing, and the idea is that they'll use some of that liquidity to make loans. Now, as I'll show later in the course, it's not possible. The only way they can lend from reserves is if all loans are in cash. And that's the 19th century, if anything, it's not today. And what you had instead, because they focused on creating reserves and giving money to banks rather than to people, you actually had the slowest recovery in post-war history. So there's the width of the bars is the width of the recorded recession. I'm looking at how long you take to go from the unemployment rate at the beginning to the same one after. And what you see is that particular period was the longest period of getting back to the pre-crisis level of unemployment in post-war history, whereas COVID, when they had to give the money to people directly, was the fastest recovery. That's again, the empirical data is ludicrously well on my side. I feel embarrassed sometimes by putting the empirical data forward because it's so strongly in my favor. But again, this is a bit like, and I'm not saying I'm as bright as Galileo, this is like Galileo talking about meteors and moons and craters, and he's going to be right and the Ptolemaics are going to be wrong. And that's all there is to it. So they again expected a rapid recovery and they were worried about inflation. So here, this is again literature in the economic report to the president by Ed Lazaire. He said, well, looking at past crises, the steeper the recession, the faster the recovery, using a linear regression there. Notice there's a very strong time trend to that data, which he didn't notice, unfortunately. He said the deeper the recession, the faster the recovery. Therefore, we think we're going to be back on growth trend in 2010, 2011, and we expect the unemployment rate to be out of 5% again in 2012. It was 8%. That's the data. So massively, massively wrong. The wrong attempt to reform the system and the wrong models about how the economy operates. So they thought there's going to be inflation because of the money multiplier. This is Charles Plosser, who's one of the most conservative of the central bank governors, saying the recovery may be more robust than we've been expecting. The cost of holding vast excess reserves may lead to a rapid increase in the money multiplier and a conversion of these excess reserves into borrowed money. Okay? This is textbook stuff and it's wrong. And they believe it. It's not a case they're being paid to say this stuff. They actually believe it. It's not what they teach students and they know better. They actually believe it. So I'll go through in the next lecture why this is a myth. But if you take a look at what they did, they made an incredible increase in the rate of growth of excess reserves. So they doubled them every year for 5 years. And what you had as a result was excess reserves going from virtually zero to trillions of dollars. Now, they thought this would cause M3 to grow dramatically, but M3, the maximum it grew by was 9% in 1 year. Quite a trivial rate of growth. So barely any change to M3, huge change to excess reserves. Again, what Keynes talked about, they're pushing on a string. Now, the trouble is they haven't changed. They haven't reformed. So Blanchard, who went through a bit of a sort of a dark tea time with the soul after the crisis hit, said, well, what we've done for the last 40 years is try to build a widely accepted analytic core to macroeconomics. He said it's a pipe dream, but it's worth pursuing. And I agree with him here. It is worth pursuing. But then he goes wrong by saying, well, the choices we made must be the right ones. Starting from explicit micro foundations is clearly essential. Where else to start from? Now, that's not a positive statement. It's saying, I can't think of any other way to do it. Well, there is, and he's chosen the wrong one. Then he says, what we've got to do is start from a model of a competitive economy, so all the microeconomics, and then modify it so it gets more realistic. And that, I know friends who do this, and it's an incredible amount of algebra. Not calculus. It should be calculus, but it's all algebra, and with crazy assumptions all the way through that they think are necessary assumptions. So they've made the wrong choices. They've gone back to doing what they were doing beforehand. So you can't build a macro model from micro, and I'll show that in future lectures. And you have to include banks and debt and money to get a decent model of the economy, and they ignore them. And they also ignore the environment. This is by far the most important point. Tony and I were talking about, what was it called? Was that Otto, the hurricane that hit Mexico yesterday? Some name like Otto, I think, and we'll take a look. It was a tropical storm, and 12 hours later, it was a Category 5 hurricane. That sort of thing. And Carlos, you're not too far from that part of the world. So they not only do they miss the global financial crisis, they're missing global warming, but they've actually helped contribute to it. So this is Nordhaus in 1991, saying that damage from 3 degrees of warming is likely to be 0.25% of national income. I said, and my hunch. Now, what on earth is the word hunch doing in a so-called academic paper? My hunch is the overall impact of 3 degrees of warming is unlikely to be larger than 2% of total output. And that means 2% of a future level of output, which is far greater than now because we're assuming 2 and 3% per annum growth over time. That actually works out to a 0.005% fall in the annual rate of economic growth. And it isn't just Nordhaus as an academic writer. This is from the IPCC report in 2022, last year, saying with historically observed levels of adaptation. Now, by that, they mean how do people go from being Eskimos to Indians, that sort of move over geography. 4 degrees of warming might cause a 10 to 23% decline in annual global GDP by 2100 relative to global GDP without warming. So the impact would be, we're assuming growth is going to go on for the next 80 years. Given the rate of growth we're assuming without global warming, future GDP would be 5 times what it's going to be today. Because of global warming, it'll only be 4 times what it is today. Now, you talk to climate scientists, and 4 degrees of warming, they say, is near enough to an extinction event for humanity. A probable, maybe the planet will be able to cope with 1 billion humans. Now, they're all madly wrong, and I'll explain why later. But to give an idea of just how bad the state of macro is and how little current students are told about this, even its stars criticize it. So Robert Solow, who developed neoclassical growth theory, was a real critic of these micro-founded models. I've linked this paper in the school site, by the way. I highly recommend downloading it, reading it for the entertainment value alone. It's quite funny. So he said the original impulse to look for better micro was a reasonable idea. What we got instead was the idea of a single agent optimizing over infinite time with perfect foresight in a world in which markets more or less flawlessly realize what they're after. How could anyone expect a sensible short to medium run macroeconomics to come out of that setup? And that's quite a reasonable statement. Paul Romer makes Robert look quite mild, because he said in a paper he's never been published, it's still online, but it's never been published in a journal, the non-committal relationship with the truth that you can find in mainstream is so bad it's not even insulting enough to call it postmodern. You've got to call it post-real. And he goes on to this wonderful satire where he says they invoked imaginary forces to explain deviations from equilibrium. So he says, I'm just going to call this stuff like ancient nonsense ideas from sciences. So phlogiston, which is the explanation chemists used to have for where fire came from. Troll, who makes changes to the wages. A gremlin, who changes prices. Ether, which changes risk preferences. And caloric, which makes you want to relax more. And he said, what matters is not money, which they leave out of their models completely, but these imaginary forces. So he took a leading, the canonical mainstream macro model by two, I think, Dutch economists, actually, Smets and Wouters, published in 2007, just before the crisis. And he said, they'll say, what they talk about the risk premium, well, that's ether. So the ether is going to explain variance in output, and the troll is going to change the wage markup, and the phlogiston will change shocks here, and there's going to be inflation driven by what the gremlin does to prices. You know, it's all nonsense. It's fantasy. It's a fairy story, and it has to go. So something has gone seriously wrong with economics, and this is the end of the formal part of the lecture. What I'd like to now is get a bit of a discussion. Tony, you'd be cheating if you contribute to this discussion, so keep your mouth shut, okay? What do you think went wrong? When did it go astray? Who led it astray? Why has it got so bad? What did that author or authors do? So let's get some ideas. Dara, Simon, Carlos, Jose, it's over to you.
I'll go for Adam Smith.
Oh, you bastard! Okay, you sport this. Who else would have said Adam Smith there? Anybody? Carlos?
No, I would say Milton Friedman.
Okay, yeah.
Right after, Keynesianism, even though Joan Robinson called it bastardized Keynesianism, what was really implemented. But I would say Milton Friedman with monetarism.
Okay, I was going to stop the share, so we were going to have a chat now. So I'll just remind me to do that, but I keep on forgetting. Okay, so you're going to Milton Friedman. Okay, Jose, what about you?
I'm not really sure, actually. I haven't read economics that much, to be honest.
Okay, well, Tony spilt the beans on who I think, but let's go over. Pardon me, looking for names here again. I've got to learn all your names over time, and my mouth has disappeared. Simon, what's your nomination?
I'm kind of partial to sort of a more materialist framework. So I think the marginalists that emphasize the ideas in people's heads about what's important, how that impacts prices and so on. So maybe starting with Alfred Marshall back then somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I do
led up to Marshall.
Yeah, as Tony spilt the beans, I do say it's Adam Smith, but that gets more subtle again. But like each of those are sensible nominations. So Friedman played an enormous role in promoting the marginalism at a time when we were breaking away from it. And he put forward this methodological idea that your assumptions don't matter. And he actually said, to a certain extent, the more ridiculous the assumptions, the better the theory. Now, funnily enough, if you read the paper, there's a footnote at that point. And he then says the obverse does not apply. So you don't get a good theory by making stupid assumptions. But that's exactly what people have done. And if you think about what people have to assume when they go into an economics course at university, let's assume perfect information. Let's assume perfect knowledge, okay? Which is saying, let's assume we're all God or Nostradamus, in which case, why do we need prices? It's absurd, but people get conditioned to absurd assumptions all the way through. And there is almost like an arms race of absurd assumptions in economics. And that goes against the way that people use assumptions in other disciplines, where they say your assumptions are there to either leave out issues which are of trivial importance. So if you included them, you get a much more complicated theory, but no great improvement in accuracy. Or there are assumptions which talk about the domain in which your theory applies. So if you have a theory about, what do you need to breathe, that theory depends upon you assuming whether you're on the surface of the planet or you're in outer space. That's what's called a domain assumption. Or you'll make an assumption where you know it's wrong, but it's a step towards a better theory, which is called a heuristic assumption. And what they do instead is make these crazy assumptions. And the worst of all as you'll find out, is on the climate change stuff. So Milton Friedman definitely observes abuse for that. He also trivialized the role of money, and he's known for monetarism, but his argument was money doesn't matter, and the only thing you should do is get it out of the system by having a consistent growth in the money supply. And he actually, if you have you read, Carlos, have you read the original paper, his The Optimum Quantity of Money?
No, written by Friedman?
Yeah.
No, I haven't. I haven't.
You should.
I've read other. I have read other works from Friedman, but that particular one I haven't.
Well, it's worth reading because, again, the stuff is always worse. If you think it's bad, you read the originals and it's worse than you expect. So in that paper, he actually argued in favor of deflation because he thought there was a utility. This is the utility point you were making earlier, Simon. A utility approach. You have a disutility by having to have money. So the less money you have, the less disutility. So the optimum quantity of money is the amount of money should fall by 7% per year. Okay. Now that means it's halves every 10 years. I think that's you divide the rate of growth into 72 and you get how fast the doubles or halves. So that would mean the money supply be falling by 50% every 10 years. I think that was the optimum. But he thought he couldn't get it through, so he fudged a few other points and then came out in favor of a 2 or 3% rate of monetary growth. And his idea of the helicopter money, that's sort of saying money is created by something outside the market economy. And that the one thing I'll say in favor of the helicopter money analogy is that let me argue for the debt jubilee, because you can actually have that money creation, but incredibly dangerous. And then Simon, your point about the switch to marginalism, that really gave us a subjective theory of value, whereas the previous classical school had an objective theory of value. This includes Adam Smith, obviously. And fundamentally, if you're going to aggregate, you have to have a empirical foundation, which is objective, because you can add up objective. One fish plus two, the second fish is two fish. If you want to add one, my preferences for a fish versus two, your preferences for a fish, you can't aggregate. And a huge part of the craziness of economics has come out of that inability to aggregate. So they make crazy assumptions to make it look like they can aggregate. And then you get a theory which is built on the mistakes of previous theory. And that's the state we're in. But as I'll argue next week, Adam Smith is a real culprit. If he hadn't made what I see as the most fundamental mistake in the history of economics, then we might have had a sensible economics from about the 1850s. Okay, so I take it that you're all correct. I mean, there's no wrong answer to that question, but the rightest one I think is take it back to Adam Smith. Oh. Boy, am I a long-winded lecturer there. So
Steve,
yeah, Carlos,
you mentioned earlier something about the Nobel Prize in Economics, and I was just wondering if the other attendees and yourself, if you have read a book called The Nobel Factor, written by some economists.
Actually, there's name very similar to Alvin's down there. Avner Offer, and Sonnenberg,
exactly.
He's actually a friend, and I mean, one of the pleasures of becoming a contrarian economist is I've met many other contrarians that I admired before I met them, and he's one of them, Avner Offer, that's his name properly. And so, in fact, Avner gave me a good little line, which we're turning up in future lectures. He's been trying to think for some time about what's the dividing line between what should be public and what should be private. And his argument is being, which he said he got from me, which is true, but in a roundabout way, it's the payback period. If the rate at which you need to invest to maintain a resource falls within the payback period of a capitalist, then it's a sensible thing to leave it to the private sector. But if your payback period is longer than that, it's dangerous to leave it to because they will underinvest and the thing will fall apart. So things like sewage systems, transportation systems, not cars obviously, but the roads, health, etc., the wrong thing to privatize, because the short-term payback period will mean they don't do the right investments. Okay, and you'll get underinvestment and then breakdown. So it's a good book, not as good as I was hoping to be more detail about the actual politics of the way in which the the central bank did that. I'd like to see some archival research and go back and look at Swedish newspapers and see the arguments being made. I'd like to see some minutes from the central bank about it, because Avner claims with the support of Sonnenberg that the reason the bank did it was because they were a bunch of neoclassical economists who didn't like the social democratic approach to the party, and they wanted to push a neoliberal agenda, and that's why they did it. And they've been bloody successful, you've got to say, unfortunately. Really quite tragic. Okay, I'm talked out. Any more comments, or we okay there for the first lecture? Simon.
I'm just curious, since private debt plays such a large role in your theory, where do we stand these days on that?
We're in an aftermath with too much private debt, but what we don't have is a large amount of credit growth. Like what I might actually do is, because we'd asked that question, I always prefer to go and look at the empirical data. So give me a second to find work I've been doing on that front right now. Let's see. I've got too many files. Where are we? Give me a second. I'll look at my other computer and find the right.
I'm sure you'll talk about it more later. I was just curious.
Yeah, it's worth saying, because I know where I put it. Hang on a second. Okay, so I'll just go and share my screen again. So that is looking at Spain. Let's look at the United States to begin with. So there's the United States level of private debt. Back in 1990, it was below 100. And actually, I'll take it further back so we can see it for quite some range. Let's take it back to 1955. So private debt began at about 60% of GDP. I think with America, I can go right back to 1945. Let's see. Yeah, so that's, one of the lowest levels of private debt in history after both the Great Depression and the Second World War. And that, to me, is a major reason why that's now regarded as the golden age of capitalism, because you didn't have the huge burden of private debt. You didn't have all the speculation going on. The turnover of money was very high, large amount of credit money versus fiat money versus credit money in the system, and so on. Inexorable rise in private debt. One bubble in the 80s, that's the stock market crash in 87 coming out there. And then you have this growth up through under the Bush and Clinton periods to the peak of private debt, and then down it comes. Now we're running, I'll just move that further out to the full range of data out there. That's what COVID caused, and back down again. Now, what you can see down the bottom is the inverse relationship in credit and unemployment. Credit goes down, unemployment goes up, and vice versa. And the higher the level debt gets to be, the more powerful that inverse relationship is. And it is a causal relationship. Credit is a major part of aggregate demand. And that's what drives the booms and busts. But now look at credit peaked at over 15% of GDP back in 2007. It's back up to highish levels again. But notice, without COVID, it was running at about half the level that applied for the last 40 or 50 years. So you haven't had the level of credit formation and credit-driven growth and credit-driven instability beforehand. So I think it's not something which you're going to give to a huge crisis, because to have a plunge like that, and that's going from 15% of GDP to minus 5% in a matter of a couple of years. To have a serious plunge like that, you've got to start from a serious height. So we're not actually at that serious height. So I still see it as a problem, and we should be trying to reduce it back to this level. That's where it should be. Okay? And we could do it as well. The mechanisms, like I've argued in favor of, like the modern debt jubilee, could do that quite successfully. But it will never happen. Okay? Again, because I've got a bunch of Tolmec economists running the whole show. So if I just go and take a look at a few other countries here, look at Spain's a very interesting example. And look at that, private debt running at 80% of GDP, all the way through to when the euro began to happen. And then bang, it goes from 80%, triples to 240% of GDP. Credit demand went from 0 to over 30% of aggregate demand, and then plunged to -20. And then look at the unemployment data. So it just shows that the extent to which credit dominates and causes the instability. You'll get some countries that manage to avoid the whole thing, and that's in fact my home country. And the funny thing is, I get criticised for predicting a crisis that didn't happen in Australia. And why didn't the crisis happen? Because I scared the pants off the bloody government, and they put in the fastest and strongest stimulus in the world, bar South Korea, I think, and therefore the crisis didn't happen. Oh, Keen got it wrong. Talk about pissing me off. But that's, you notice here, higher level of private debt than the Americans have, higher level of credit when the crisis began. So rather than 15%, it's about 25%, but it didn't go negative. And the reason is because the government went really high. The backstory is that I was interviewed on the major news magazine called the 7:30 Report 1 week. And I got normally a segment of the 7:30 Report, which is a half-hour show, lasts about 5 or 6 minutes. I got 15 minutes with the host asking me about my views. And the next day he interviewed the Prime Minister and savaged him with my analysis. And the week after that, the Prime Minister announced a trebling of the grants they gave for home buyers to buy a house, a bonus of $1,000 to every taxpayer, and a whole range of schemes to build school halls throughout the whole country and to put insulation material in people's houses. Enormous fiscal stimulus. And that's what meant the credit didn't go negative because there's so much money turning up. Speculation began again. And so I get criticized for not seeing a crisis coming that I prevented. Long-winded answer, but I hope that helped.
That did. Thank you.
Yeah.
One
Yes.
other thing, Steve, I wanted to ask you, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember that you did in one of your lectures, you mentioned that money has to be created in the public and in the private sphere, right? I don't know if you know this, but here in Latin America, we have created legislation that prohibits central banks from purchasing government securities in the primary and in the secondary markets. And that can only be done in situations of catastrophe.
Oh, so, we're going to have them.
So, and for example, the central bank in Guatemala, in Costa Rica, in Chile, all these banks have all these central banks have these restrictions. And the thing is, how do you go around that thing? I mean, if you want to create money in the public sphere as well.
Well, I mean, the deficit itself creates the money. The bonds change the backing of the money from being reserves to being bonds. And the actual act of creating a deficit boosts both deposits, which of course is private money, but also reserves. And reserves, if you want to actually make it successful, my suggestion would be to reduce the interest rate on reserves to 0. Okay. And then when the Treasury offers bonds, the bonds are going to offer a positive return. So you'd be a moron of a bank not to take advantage of the positive return. Let's say if there's a rate of interest on reserves of say 5%, and the bonds are also 5%, there'd be no point in making the swap. And then the Treasury would fail to sell its bonds, and that would be seen as a crisis. But if you wanted to ensure that the bonds are still sold, despite the inability of the central bank to buy them, then the best way would be to have a big differential between the rate of interest on reserves and the rate of interest on bonds.
Yeah, the problem that we have, for example, is that mostly private banks buy these treasuries, and the thing is that from MMT we have heard that, and you've said it as well, that the government deficit is the private sector surplus, right?
Yeah. Yep.
But what happens when the surplus of the private sector is just concentrated in just a few hands?
That's one of the trouble. The inequality that's been caused is, and that Latin America's got the worst example of that on the planet. I've got to remember the name of the Argentinian economist I know who did some very good work on that front. I can't drag his name out of my brain right now, but he pointed out that when you look at capitalist versus worker consumption, in America, it was roughly 70% of consumption you could see as worker consumption and 30% capitalist consumption. In Latin America, it's 70% capitalist and 30% worker. Massive level of inequality. And in many ways, Latin American capitalists are trying to emulate American capitalists and screw the poor type attitude as well. And that then means, of course, the state becomes a way that they get their hands on that money as well. So, yeah, your main problem really is that massive inequality.
Yeah, that's correct. The thing is, the problem is that most central banks, they continue to work under this monetarism philosophy. And how do you begin to change that? I think that it's the biggest challenge that we are facing right now.
It is. I mean, that's one reason I developed Minsky, because Minsky lets you do the accounting. And in fact, I was actually talking to a New York Times reporter for the last 2 hours before the show began, taking him through the accounting involved in the simple accounting of how money is created both by the private sector and by central banks, and just shows that the government is not borrowing; it's selling bonds to the public to enable reserves which don't earn any interest to be converted into bonds which do earn interest, which actually benefits the private banks, et cetera, et cetera. So you get a completely different orientation if you understand the accounting. And like, I only learned the accounting because I built Minsky. Okay? I was wrong about it when I used to talk about this issue before I actually built that software package to show it. But the trouble is, you've got people who've been brainwashed this way and brainwashed and given PhDs for the process. So, it's so locked into that neoclassical way of thinking. And the only way out of it, unfortunately, is normally a crisis like a world war or what's coming over with climate. And then you've got to basically spend as much as you possibly can. It's the public sector that does the spending, and then all the mechanisms, because it's actually objectively true that the government doesn't have to borrow to spend, then all the mechanisms that exist there will be put into action by people who don't understand those mechanisms. But it will still happen. Tony, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the Gower Initiative people and Mariam Anna Matsukuta's department at UCL. They've done a thing called the self-financing state.
Okay, yeah.
And one of the bits that hit me was the main treasury in the UK, the main treasury account with the Bank of England is called a consolidated fund.
Yeah.
It's set at 0 at the end of every working day.
Yeah.
All government spending the following day is new money put into that account by the central bank. It's no other mechanism whatsoever.
Yeah, and all balanced out at the end. When I do my Minsky modeling, fundamentally, if you have bonds being sold were equal to the deficit plus interest on existing bonds, then mathematically it remains at 0 indefinitely. And it is just a conduit for government money creation. It's not at all a thing which they've got to tax or borrow money to augment for their spending. Yeah. And yeah, pardon me, gotta look at learning names here. So Dara.
Yeah. So when I finished my undergraduate degree, I left being like not only frustrated, but also very cynical towards economists and economics in general, and felt that it was maybe more than just stupidity, but actually almost by design to serve the capitalist system, where when you speak, it's I guess a bit more about stupidity that you would talk about, and slightly less cynically. So I was wondering, like, how much would you put down to stupidity and ignorance, and how much is maybe more suspicious, I would say?
I'd say it's 80-20. 80% stupidity, 20% the stupidity benefits powerful people who then finance you to keep on making stupid statements that they equally don't necessarily know are stupid, but it benefits them. So if you look at what government, I was talking about this to the New York Times journalist a short while ago, all the impact of attempts to reduce the deficit, since that's seen as a good idea, they never cut down military spending, they never cut subsidies for powerful people. It's always spending on the poor that gets cut back. So money that should go to health and welfare and education gets slashed, and whereas Rupert Murdoch is never going to be unable to go to the hospital because Medicare is not funded well. you'll buy the hospital. And so what you get is this ends up being a support system for the ultra wealthy. But of course, it's a destructive support system, because you'd actually have a more prosperous economy if you spent the money on the poor. And this is one of Coletti's arguments, which is extremely important. If you give money to poor people, they spend it and it ends up in the pockets of capitalists. So ironically, they're actually reducing their own income by being anti a deficit. But that goes along with the stupidity issue.
Okay.
What's your
thank you.
feeling? What's your guess? What you're saying? Does 80-20 sound right to you, or?
I would have probably added maybe more towards 60-40, but I get your point and agree.
Yeah, I spent so long in economics departments that I just know what these people are like. And like funnily enough, my economics department at the University of Western Sydney, where I began my heavy academic career, most often the union reps were the economics department people, but they're anti-union at the same time.
Mhm.
Their capacity to hold two contrary thoughts in their heads and act on the wrong one was just remarkable. And a lot of the, most neoclassical economists work for the government. They're anti-government. They work for the government, and they end up shooting themselves in the foot in terms of their own pay rates. I just find it ludicrous, because like self-interest would tell them they should be doing this for their own benefit, but they're altruistically screwing everybody. Darrow, Alvin's popping in on the 60-40 on your front as well, by the way. But I'm going to stick with my 80-20. Tony.
I'd probably go 90-10.
I'm sympathetic.
Different point. I think if people want to start looking at contrarian viewpoints, Blair Fix's economics from the top down is a good addition to what you say. And one of the things that he said recently is he's worked through a huge amount of data, which he has great difficulty with, the same as you, is yes, every state that can afford it has a benefit system, a social security system, whatever you want to call it. But the corollary of that is if you've got a basic level at the bottom, you have to have a maximum level at the top. So the top has to be capped.
Has to be constrained. And that's ultimately why neoclassical economics benefits the rich, because they don't want those constraints. But you would actually get a healthier system if you had those constraints. And the other issue, of course, is ecological sustainability, which has gone out the window. So it's a bloody messy world we've found ourselves in. And I think one of my colleagues said that we don't have a problem, we have a predicament. A problem at least has a solution. A predicament you might never get out of, and that's where we've found ourselves in very, very close times of seeing just how deadly that predicament is going to be. Jose.
Yeah, I would also say around like 80-90 to 10-20, because the few courses I did in economics, something that a question I will always ask is like, what is the short run and what is the long run in all of these models that they will always talk about? And they never really had an answer for that. They would be like, well, the long run is when this happened. But I was like, so do we have an idea when that is supposed to happen? And they were like, not really, but they were kind of like, yeah, just go along with it. Like, yeah, this is how we talk about this, and this is what's supposed to happen in the short run, and this is what's supposed to happen in the long run. But they never really said what is the time.
One example of that, for example, is the deficit issue, because if you take a look at the American government and see how long has it been in deficit, and what's the average deficit, 120 years of data you can find. The White House has a really good database there, and the average deficit over the last 120 years has been, I think, 2.5% of GDP, and if you take out wars, it's 2% of GDP. So isn't 120 years long? That's 2 human lifetimes. It's 6 generations, or 5 generations. Surely that's the long run. But you're right, they will not quantify anything that doesn't end up with an answer they like.
Yeah.
So it's very, very, it's very mendacious, and that's what got to me like very, very early on when I first read Samuelson's paper, summing up, and thought, holy hell, this is not what I'm learning in his textbook. What's going on here? I'm being lied to. And as much as I hate the government's lying to you stuff that the marketing company puts out, in a fundamental sense, it's true. The mendacity, unfortunately, is the rule. And Alwyn, come on, stop. Just you can talk here. Why don't you show your face too? Come on. Alwyn's one of the absolute stalwarts of the long course on a Thursday. Come on, Alwyn.
Well, I
He's
don't
gonna
really
talk.
want
Well,
take-
come on, why don't you show your face, mate?
I don't want to take advantage of this, but I think it's absolutely great that we've got more and more people getting into this knowledge in this area, because I think that's a wonderful thing you just said, Steve, about being a predicament rather than a problem.
Yeah.
That's absolutely spot on the button. And incidentally, folks, new students, this is a capability this guy Steve Keen has. He comes out with these zingers of phrases.
I can't claim that one, Alwyn, and somebody else, one of my climate scientist friends said that, so I've got to attribute that to somebody else, but it's a great line.
Okay, but you still know them when you hear them.
Yeah, I do. Jose, that lecture on Thursday is the one that costs $500 a year to join. So they are separate. People who paid for that one can come in here and not vice versa. But what I've done with great help from Alwyn and Tony and quite a few others in the long lecture, I've really refined my whole presentation. So I think even though it'll take longer to go through the whole material, this will be a better set of lectures overall than the ones I put together. So you're not missing out on anything, it's getting it more slowly. All right, well, I think that's about it for the evening, everybody. Thank you for coming along. Please encourage the others to turn up, because there's about another 10 people who've signed up. I'd like them to be here, and I want this to grow over time. So please help me getting that done. See you all next week.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.